In this list, we'll talk about the 10 least good Blue Eyes White Dragon support cards. Because honestly, they don't have very many bad cards in their archetype. Most of the cards in this list will just be kind of mediocre, but that will technically make them the worst of the Blue Eyes cards. And at number 10, we have Rage with Eyes of Blue. Definitely one of the better cards on this list. Basically, this card was created to simulate that one move in the anime where the main character Kaiba summoned 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons in one turn. And what this card does is you can banish this card as well as many cards as possible from your hand, field, or graveyard face down. And if you did, you can special summon up to 3 copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon from your deck. And then it also locks you from summoning other monsters except Blue Eyes White Dragons for the turn. Which means this has to be one of the first things you do during your turn. Now, banishing everything in your hand, field, and graveyard face down is a pretty steep cost to bring out 3 3K beat sticks, assuming all 3 of them were in your deck. But hey, if you have no other cards in the field or in your hand when you use this card, it's 1 card to bring out 3 strong monsters. It's not half bad, just not really a situation you should be expecting yourself to be in. There's no way to gain advantage off of this card's particular banish, as it's the bad one, which banishes the cards face down. It also locks you out of extra deck play, so you can't use those 3 blue eyes to bring out better monsters. And another little interesting caveat with this card, this is one of the few cards in the game whose effect can be negated with MST. As one of the conditions for this card's effect to go off is that you have to banish this card as well as all the other ones listed. So if your opponent chains an MST to this card to destroy it, you won't be able to banish it from your side of the field, and its effect will stop there. Making this card one of the few cards in the game whose effect can be stopped with MST, that is not a continuous face-up card or a field spell card. And because this card exists, you can technically say that MST does negate at least 1 card in the game, even if it's not technically a negate, and more of a stopping the effect from happening, which is kind of the same thing anyway. And at number 9, we have Deep Eyes White Dragon. This card has an effect where when a Blue Eyes monster you control is destroyed by an opponent, and you have a Dragon-type monster in your graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, you can do 600 points of burn damage to your opponent for each Dragon-type monster with different names in your graveyard. So it's kind of like a recovery tool if your Blue Eyes are getting destroyed. But here's the thing with its weird burn damage. Blue Eyes decks are a little bit like Harpy decks in that some of their cards treat their names as Blue Eyes White Dragon. So having this card do more burn damage based on the different names seems kind of counterintuitive to the Blue Eyes White Dragon archetype. Its next effect is a little odd. When this card is summoned, you can target a Dragon-type monster in your graveyard, and this card's attack will become equal to that monster's attack. So, if using a Blue Eyes deck, there's a good chance you'll be able to give this card 3000 attack, which is pretty good. It's kind of a wonder why it doesn't have 3000 attack baseline though, considering any kind of negate will drop its attack down to 0, and make it real easy to beat over, since for some reason it has 0 attack and defense on a level 10 monster. Now, this card would be kind of mediocre, leaning on the bad side, if it wasn't for this last effect, where if this card is destroyed by a card effect on the field, you get to destroy all of your opponent's monsters. That's honestly a pretty decent effect, considering you can proc it yourself. Half the reason people play Starving Venom Fusion Dragon as a super poly target is because it blows up your opponent's cards on its destruction as well. Not to say Deep Eyes White Dragon is anywhere near on the same level of usefulness as Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, but I am saying its ability to destroy your opponent's monsters on its destruction is actually decent, even if it only works on card effects. So, if your opponent just destroys it by battle, no explosion occurs. And at number 8, we have Blue Eyes Chaos Dragon. This is another Blue Eyes ritual monster, which can use Chaos Form to ritual summon it, and is the second Blue Eyes ritual monster that can use Chaos Form to bring it out. So when it was announced, people were excited to hear what its effects were, because Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon was a pretty popular card with seemingly decent effects, even if it didn't see any competitive success. So what Blue Eyes Chaos Dragon does is it cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects, which is the same baseline effect as Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon. You know, really good protection. Unlike Max Dragon though, the next effect of this card requires it to specifically be ritual summoned using a BlueEyes White Dragon, where, if it declares an attack, you can change the battle position of all of your opponent's monsters, and then change their attack and defense to 0 permanently. And also, this card will gain piercing damage, so if it attacks into one of those new 0 defense monsters, your opponent will take 3,000 points of damage. Now, all of that sounds decent, but here's the thing. BlueEyes Chaos Max Dragon has the same summoning requirements, except it doesn't require specifically a BlueEyes White Dragon to gain its effect, where it will always have piercing damage, and in fact it does double piercing damage on top of having 1,000 more attack, making it a 4k attack double piercing battle damage machine. So BlueEyes Chaos Dragon, who has the exact same summoning requirements, has more restrictions on a worse effect, especially since it doesn't work on Link monsters, was kind of a disappointment to say the least. It's still not really a bad card though, it's just not very good when compared to the other BlueEyes support cards, and that's why it's kind of a low spot on this list, but still makes the list nonetheless. And at number 7, we have BlueEyes Solid Dragon. This one is kind of the same case as BlueEyes Chaos Dragon, where it's very obviously similar to another good BlueEyes support card, only with a worse effect. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can permanently negate the effect of one monster your opponent controls. Now, okay, that's a decent effect if it had a way to special summon itself during your opponent's turn, but it doesn't do that. You'd have to bring it out in some other way in order to gain this effect during your opponent's turn, when it would be most useful to disrupt plays. But I guess if you're playing against an opponent who has a really nasty Marshmallow that you can't get over, then this card would be your go-to for negating that effect during your turn. Now, its other effect is a quick effect, where if your opponent activates a card or effect, you can shuffle this card from your field into your deck to special summon a BlueEyes White Dragon from your deck. So if your opponent's trying to get rid of this card with a card effect, you can chain its effect to that in order to tag out with the BlueEyes White Dragon, which is actually a pretty decent effect. Now, there is another card called Dragon Spirit of White, who came out earlier than BlueEyes Solid Dragon and has similar effects. Dragon Spirit of White has the same stats, is treated as a normal monster while in the hand or graveyard, so it's easier to bring out with normal monster support, and when this card is summoned, you can banish one of your opponent's spell or trap cards, and its quick effect can be activated whenever your opponent just controls a monster, where you contribute this card to special summon a BlueEyes White Dragon from your hand. So having the same stat line of 2,500 attack and 2,000 defense, having an effect on summon, and being able to tag out with the BlueEyes, it's pretty obvious these two cards are supposed to be similar, except for the fact that Solid Dragon is not treated as a normal monster for some reason, and banishing a spell or trap card during your turn is much more useful than negating a monster effect during your turn. And there's also the problem that it can't bring itself out from your hand, so it just adds to the bricking problem that BlueEyes decks already have. So while it's a fine card, it's just a worse version of Spirit of White. And at number 6, we have Malefic BlueEyes White Dragon. This card is more of a Malefic card than it is a BlueEyes card. That's probably why it's on this list. The Malefic monsters are all based off of other monsters, usually iconic dragons, and they just require you to banish a copy of the original dragon from your deck in order to special summon the Malefic version from your hand. And they also have the negative effects of not allowing your other cards to attack. Now, out of all of the Malefic cards, the two that saw the most amount of play were the two Malefics that banish cards from the extra deck, Malefic Stardust Dragon and Malefic Cyber Dragon. And that's because having to banish a card from your extra deck is much more convenient than having to banish a monster from your main deck that you have no intention of playing. Because if you do draw into that BlueEyes White Dragon while playing Malefic BlueEyes White Dragon, the original BlueEyes is basically a garnet in your hand, and you want it to stay in the deck. Something you don't have to worry about at all with the Stardust and Cyber Dragon Malefic monsters. Other than that, Malefic BlueEyes is a perfectly reasonable 3k beat stick that you can special summon from your hand. It's just there's no reason to use it in a BlueEyes deck, as you don't want your BlueEyes cards banished, and it's not very popular in Malefic decks either. And at number 5, we have Burst Stream of Destruction. This is a normal spell card which destroys all of your opponent's monsters, with two little caveats. You must control a Blue-Eyes White Dragon, and your Blue-Eyes White Dragons cannot attack the turn you use this effect. So here's what's mediocre about this card, because destroying all of your opponent's monsters is not a bad effect. It's that you cannot attack the turn you use this card. Generally, if you want to clear out your opponent's field, it's because you also want to attack in the same turn in order to win. So if you just clear out their field and then have to wait with all of your 3k beat sticks out, your opponent's going to get another turn to just build their board back up, and get rid of the cards on your field and then attack. You also need to have a face-up Blue-Eyes in order to use this effect, so it's not a very good comeback card, like Raigeki or Dark Hole can be, where the number one use those two cards have is using them to get rid of your opponent's board in order to set up your own, or to come back after your opponent destroyed all of your cards, or to get rid of all your opponent's monsters to attack directly. So really, the no attack for the Blue-Eyes really limits the potential of this card, and requires you to have a Blue-Eyes on the field limits the comeback potential this card can have as well, making it a pretty mediocre option that most Blue-Eyes players don't bother using, especially since cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole exist and are far better generic cards than this Blue-Eyes specific archetype card. And at number 4, we have Blue-Eyes Toon Dragon. This card is more of a Toon support card than it is a Blue-Eyes support card, but it is still a Blue-Eyes White Dragon card nonetheless, because all Toon cards are based off of other monsters, kinda just like the Malefics. Basically, if they create an archetype based off of existing cards, there's a good chance they'll make a Blue-Eyes White Dragon version of it. Now, out of all of the Toon monsters that exist, Blue-Eyes Toon Dragon was one of the first ones to come out, which means it's also one of the worst ones because the first iteration of Toon monsters kinda sucked. And the best use Blue-Eyes Toon Dragon ever had was in Exodia decks that never actually used the card, and instead used the fact that it was a level 8 Toon monster. So you could run 3 copies of Toon Table of Contents to search each other out, and then use the last one to search out Blue-Eyes Toon Dragon, and then use trade-in on that Toon Dragon in order to keep drawing more cards. It wasn't used very much as an actual monster to do things, and more used as a draw engine, which, hey, makes it a lot more useful than a lot of the other cards on this list, but a card that's useful in a way where it's never actually used, I think deserves a higher spot on this list, but not the highest spot. And at number 3, we have Dragon's Fighting Spirit. This is a card that allows you to target a dragon-type monster you control that was special summoned this turn, and then it counts the number of monsters your opponent controls that were also special summoned this turn. Then it gives your dragon monster extra attacks equal to the amount of your opponent's monsters. Now, on surface level, this card seems kinda bad, because it only grants extra attacks if your opponent special summoned monsters during your turn. But there are ways to use this card to actually, win the game. If you use cards that let you summon cards on your opponent's side of the field, like Ojama Trio, Ojama Duo, or Nightmare Archifiends, those count as special summon monsters to your opponent's side of the field for this card's effect. And then, if you use this card on your face-up Blue-Eyes Chaos Max Dragon, for example, who can do double piercing damage, that's enough for an OTK with all those extra attacks. The only problem with this, though, is it's kind of a convoluted combo to set up, as you'd have to build your entire deck around this card, and it's never a good idea to build your entire deck around an unsearchable quick play spell card. And there's also a whole bunch of other ways to OTK your opponent using Ojama Trio, and none of them are exactly meta levels of efficient. It's a fun little gimmick, sure, just not very competitive. As someone who specifically built their channel on gimmick decks, I do consider myself somewhat of an expert when it comes to gimmick decks, which is why I'm the first person who will tell you that just because something works sometimes in gimmick decks doesn't make it good. It does, however, make them very fun to play, and that's why I prefer using gimmick decks over meta decks. I just have to know there is a trade-off, where I'm definitely going to lose a lot more games. Also, I know this card doesn't specifically list Blue-Eyes White Dragon in it, but it does literally have Blue-Eyes White Dragon in its card artwork. It also works on basically all of the Blue-Eyes White Dragon cards, so I'm including it on this list. And at number 2, we have Dragon Master Knight. This card is a 5,000 attack beatstick, who can gain an additional 500 attack for every dragon-type monster you control, except this card, for a grand total of 7,500 attack if you have out 5 other dragons. Now, a 5k attack beatstick is pretty decent, just not when it's difficult to bring out and has no inherent protection. You see, Dragon Master Knight requires the BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon, plus Blackluster Soldier as its fusion materials. So as long as you just use a fusion substitute monster, you don't have to worry about using BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon. But that would mean you'd have to run this card in basically a Blackluster Soldier deck that also ran fusion substitute monsters, which kinda kills the consistency of the deck, as Blackluster Soldier decks don't normally run fusions or fusion substitute monsters. So the best case scenario, you get out a BLS and a fusion substitute monster in the graveyard, and then use Dragon's Mirror to bring out this card. In that scenario, having a 5k beatstick is actually pretty good, just as long as your opponent doesn't destroy it, and you use other better cards to clear out the field of problem cards first. Because modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Requires more than just beatsticks out in the field. They have to do other things as well to be considered good. But even then, a 5k beatstick is nothing to scoff at, especially if you get it out under the best case scenario conditions. Which is why it's just a mediocre card rather than a bad one. But it's still definitely not one of the better BlueEyes cards, that's for sure. Even BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon is better than this card, and mainly because BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon doesn't have the little clause on it that says it must be fusion summoned, which unfortunately this card does have. Which actually makes it a little worse than a 4500 attack beatstick that requires 3 specific materials and has no effect. Since you can cheat BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon out, but you can't cheat out Dragon Master Knight. And at number 1, we have BlueEyes Shiny Dragon. This card is an excellent example of a monster with a good effect, but a summoning requirement that is too difficult for it to be worth it. Its effect is that if it's targeted by an effect of any card, you can just negate that effect. And negate without destruction, which is still good, just not as good if it also destroyed the card it was negating. It also gains 300 attack for each dragon monster in your graveyard. So, if you have the 3 BlueEyes used for the BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon, plus that BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon in your graveyard, that's 1200 extra attack right there, making it a 4200 beatstick that can negate targeted effects. But here's the problem with this card. It requires you to tribute a BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon in order to bring out this card from your hand. BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon is a somewhat difficult to bring out fusion monster, and because this card requires you to tribute a fusion monster for its summon, you can't cheat the effect with a name-changing card, like you could if it required a main deck monster. Elemental Hero Prisma doesn't work on it, because that only copies the names of cards that are fusion materials of a fusion monster, and not a fusion monster themselves. Phantom of Chaos doesn't work, because it can only copy the names of effect monsters, and BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon is not an effect monster. And also Fusion Tag doesn't work, because it only allows you to copy the name of a fusion monster if it's being used specifically for a fusion summon, which BlueEyes Shiny Dragon is not. And Shiny Dragon also needs to be in your hand in order to bring it out, which luckily is not that big of a deal in BlueEyes decks, as they do actually have ways to search out this card pretty easily. The main problem is really just getting the Ultimate Dragon out on the field, for the sole purpose of tributing it for Shiny Dragon, which isn't really worth all the effort required in order to do that. There are ways to cheat BlueEyes Ultimate Dragon out on the field without having to fusion summon it properly, but even those require more resources than are really worth putting into a Shiny Dragon. That being said, there is a newer BlueEyes support card which combos very well with Shiny Dragon called the Ultimate Creature of Destruction, which if used on Shiny Dragon basically makes it invincible for a turn, and gives it the ability to attack over anything. Although even in that case, there are probably better targets for the Ultimate Creature of Destruction than BlueEyes Shiny Dragon. Shiny Dragon is just a decent boss monster who is too difficult to be brought out and isn't really worth the effort to try to bring it out, when BlueEyes decks can do so much more than dump all of the resources into bringing out one card that can be destroyed with non-targeting effects, or just destroyed by battle. It's really not that hard to take out a BlueEyes Shiny Dragon, and that's why BlueEyes Shiny Dragon is the worst of the BlueEyes support cards, but still only really a mediocre card when compared to actual bad cards like the Humble Sentry. Alright, and that's it for the list. If you think I missed any worst BlueEyes support cards, think some of the Blue Eyes support cards in this list are actually much better than I give them credit, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.